The dust swirled on the horizon like a golden phantom as Joanna Sinclair stood on her porch, clutching a letter that had grown soft from years of handling. The year was 1879, and Unionville, Nevada had changed little in the decade since her husband's death, though the silver mines that had once made the town prosperous were beginning to yield less with each passing month. The widow's eyes strained against the setting sun, watching the lone figure approaching on horseback, his silhouette growing more distinct with each passing moment. 10 years had passed since Joanna had buried her husband Thomas, a victim of the mining accident that claimed 12 men's lives that terrible autumn day in 1869. At 32, she had managed to maintain their modest ranch on the outskirts of Unionville through sheer determination, and the help of local hands who respected the tenacious widow who refused to sell and move east as so many had suggested. The rider drew closer, and Joanna's breath caught in her throat. She recognized the way he sat in the saddle, straight-backed yet relaxed, a posture she had memorized in her youth. Xavier Sutton had returned just as his last letter had promised. The correspondence that had sustained her these past months had finally manifested into flesh and blood, riding toward her doorstep as the Nevada sun cast long shadows across her land. Xavier had been 19 when he left Unionville after the death of his father, a respected rancher whose debts had forced his only son to seek fortune elsewhere. Now, 12 years later, he returned a man of 31, hardened by the frontier, but somehow still carrying that same determined glint in his eye that Joanna remembered from their youth. She watched as he dismounted at her gate, removing his hat to reveal hair the color of chestnuts, now streaked with the occasional strand of silver at the temples. His face was more weathered than she remembered, lines etched at the corners of his eyes from years squinting against prairie suns, but his smile remained unchanged, warm and genuine as he approached the steps where she stood. "Mrs. Sinclair," he greeted her formally, though his eyes spoke of a familiarity that transcended the years between them. "Mr. Sutton," she replied, her voice betraying more emotion than she had intended. "You've returned to Unionville after all this time." He nodded, climbing the steps to stand before her. She could smell the leather and sage that clung to him, could see the small scar above his right eyebrow that hadn't been there when he left. "I made a promise to my father before he died that I would return one day to settle matters properly." Joanna nodded, understanding the weight of promises. "You'll find things have changed here. And some things remain exactly as I remember them," he replied, his gaze holding hers for a moment longer than was proper. She looked away first, composing herself. "You must be tired from your journey. Would you care for some coffee? That would be most welcome, Mrs. Sinclair." As she turned to lead him inside, Xavier's voice stopped her. "I heard about Thomas. I'm sorry I couldn't return for the funeral." Joanna paused, her hand on the doorframe. "It was a long time ago, Mr. Sutton." "Xavier," he corrected gently. "We've known each other too long for such formalities, haven't we?" She smiled slightly, memories of their shared childhood flooding back of days spent exploring the foothills before silver was discovered, before responsibilities and tragedy had shaped them into who they were today. "Xavier, then, come inside. There's much to discuss." The interior of Joanna's home was modest but comfortable, decorated with simple furnishings, and the occasional touch that spoke of feminine care embroidered pillows on the settee, dried wildflowers arranged in a ceramic vase. Xavier removed his hat and coat, hanging them on the peg by the door as Joanna busied herself at the cast-iron stove. "Your letters mentioned you've been ranging cattle in Wyoming territory," she said, placing a kettle over the flame. Xavier nodded, settling himself at her kitchen table built by her husband's hands years ago. "Started with 20 head and built up to nearly 500 before I sold the operation. The winters were harsh, and I found myself missing the Nevada skies more than I expected." Joanna set 2 cups on the table along with a tin of sugar. "And now you've returned for good." "That depends," Xavier replied, watching as she poured the steaming coffee. "My father's land has passed to other hands, as you know. I've come back with enough to purchase new property if I can find the right piece of earth." Their eyes met briefly over the rising steam from their cups. Joanna had been fighting offers for her land for years now, especially from the mining interests that coveted the water rights that came with her property. She wondered if Xavier knew about her struggles, if perhaps he had returned with an offer of his own. Unionville isn't what it was, she warned him. The mines are producing less each year. Many have already abandoned their claims and moved on to the next promising strike. Xavier sipped his coffee thoughtfully. I didn't come back for silver, Joanna. I came back for other reasons. The way he said it made her look up sharply. There was an intentional weight to his words, one that transported her back to their youth, to stolen moments behind her father's barn, to whispered promises that had been interrupted by life's crueler plans. You always did have a way of speaking in riddles, Xavier Sutton, she replied, trying to mask the flutter in her chest with a teasing tone. He smiled, the creases around his eyes deepening. And you always saw through them, Joe. The childhood nickname slipped out naturally, and for a moment they were young again, untouched by the decade of separation and the sorrows each had endured. But reality quickly reasserted itself as Joanna rose to stir the stew that had been simmering all afternoon. You're welcome to stay for supper, she offered. It's nothing fancy, just rabbit stew. I'd be honored, Xavier replied, though I should see to my horse first. The old stable still stands. There's fresh hay in the loft. Xavier nodded, finishing his coffee before rising. I won't be long. And Joanna. He paused at the door. It truly is good to see you again. After he left, Joanna leaned against the counter, taking a deep breath. Xavier's return was stirring emotions she had carefully packed away years ago. Before Thomas, there had been Xavier, her first love, the boy who had kissed her under the harvest moon and promised to come back for her once he made something of himself. But life had intervened. Her father's illness, Xavier's father's debts, and then Thomas Sinclair, kind and stable, offering her security when she needed it most. She had loved Thomas in her way. He had been a good husband, a decent man. Their marriage hadn't been one of passion but of mutual respect and companionship. When he died, she mourned him genuinely, but the heart that broke was not the same one that had once pounded in her chest at the sight of Xavier Sutton riding across her father's fields. Now Xavier had returned, carrying with him the echo of what might have been. Joanna straightened her apron and composed herself. She was no longer a young girl swayed by handsome smiles and whispered promises. She was a widow of 10 years, a woman who had fought to keep her land and her independence in a town where both were increasingly rare for someone of her gender. When Xavier returned from the stable, they ate supper together, their conversation gradually easing from the awkward formality of strangers to the comfortable rhythm of old friends. He told her of his years in Wyoming, of the cattle drives and the characters he'd met along the way. She shared stories of Unionville's changes, carefully avoiding mention of her own struggles with the mining company that had been pressuring her to sell. As the evening stretched on, Xavier helped her clear the dishes, their hands occasionally brushing in a way that sent unexpected warmth through her fingers. When the kitchen was clean, they moved to the small parlor, where Joanna lit the lamps against the gathering darkness. I should be going, Xavier said, though he made no move to retrieve his hat. I've taken enough of your evening. Where are you staying? Joanna asked, realizing she hadn't inquired earlier. The Western Hotel in town, at least until I find more permanent arrangements. Joanna nodded, knowing the establishment respectable enough, though overpriced for what it offered. Well, you're welcome to visit again. Perhaps I could show you some of the properties that might be available if you're serious about settling here again. Xavier smiled. I'd like that very much, Joanna. He moved toward the door, retrieving his hat from the peg. Would tomorrow be too soon? I've been away from Unionville for too long, and I'm eager to reacquaint myself with the land. Tomorrow would be fine. I need to go into town for supplies anyway. We could meet at Donovan's general store at noon. I'll be there, he promised, placing his hat on his head. He hesitated at the door as if there was more he wanted to say, but then simply tipped his hat with a smile. Good night, Joanna. Good night, Xavier. After he left, Joanna stood at the window, watching his figure disappear down the moonlit path toward town. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the rapid beat of her heart beneath her fingers. It had been so long since she had felt this way, this curious mixture of anticipation and trepidation. Xavier Sutton had been her past, but whether he had a place in her future remained to be seen. The next morning dawned clear and bright, typical for a Nevada spring. Joanna rose early, completing her chores with more energy than usual. She gathered eggs from the henhouse, fed her small herd of goats, and checked on the vegetable garden that had just begun to show promising sprouts. By mid-morning, she had bathed and changed into her best day dress, a simple navy blue cotton with white piping that she reserved for trips into town. As she hitched her mare to the buckboard, Joanna couldn't help but scan the horizon, half expecting to see Xavier riding toward her ranch. But the landscape remained empty save for the distant mountains and the scattered sagebrush that dotted the Nevada desert. The 12-mile journey into Unionville gave her time to collect her thoughts. Xavier's return had been unexpected, stirring emotions she had believed long buried. Yet she couldn't afford to be swept away by sentiment. Her ranch was her security, her independence. And though she hadn't mentioned it to Xavier, the pressure to sell had been mounting. Samuel Barrett, owner of the Silver Crown Mining Company, had made it clear he wouldn't take no for an answer much longer. As she approached town, Joanna noted the changes that had occurred over the past few years. Unionville had once been the county seat, bustling with activity when the mines were at their peak. Now, several buildings stood empty, their windows boarded up, silent testaments to the town's gradual decline. Still, the main street maintained some semblance of vitality. Donovan's General Store, the Western Hotel, the assayer's office, and the Silver Dollar Saloon all continued to conduct business. Joanna tied her horse outside the general store and entered to find Eliza Donovan, the proprietor's wife, arranging a display of canned goods. "Joanna Sinclair, as I live and breathe," Eliza greeted her warmly. "2 visits in 1 week. To what do we owe this pleasure?" "Hello, Eliza." "I'm just here for a few supplies," Joanna replied, retrieving her list from her pocket. "And I'm meeting someone at noon." Eliza's eyebrows rose with interest. "Meeting someone, not that Barrett fellow again, I hope." "The way he follows you around town whenever you're here isn't proper, widow or not." Joanna shook her head. "No, not Mr. Barrett. An old friend has returned to town, Xavier Sutton." "Xavier Sutton?" Eliza's eyes widened. "Why, I remember him. Left after his father died, didn't he?" "Handsome boy, as I recall." "He was 19 when he left," Joanna corrected gently. "Hardly a boy, and yes, after his father's passing. He's returned looking to settle here again." Eliza's smile turned knowing. "I seem to remember there was something between you two before Thomas came along." Joanna busied herself examining a bolt of calico, avoiding Eliza's perceptive gaze. "That was a long time ago, Eliza. We were children, hum," Eliza hummed skeptically. "Well, speaking of your admirer, there he is now." Joanna looked up, expecting to see Xavier, but instead found Samuel Barrett peering through the store window. When their eyes met, he tipped his hat and entered, his expensive suit and gold watch chain marking him as one of the few prosperous men left in Unionville. "Mrs. Sinclair," Barrett greeted, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "What a fortunate coincidence. I was just thinking about calling on you later this week." "Mr. Barrett," Joanna acknowledged with a cool nod. At 45, Barrett was not an unattractive man, with his carefully trimmed beard and confident bearing. But there was a calculating quality to his gaze that had always made her uneasy. "I hope you've been considering my offer," he continued, moving closer. "As I mentioned during our last conversation, the price I've proposed is more than fair, especially given the challenges a woman alone faces in maintaining a ranch of that size." Before Joanna could respond, the door opened again and Xavier stepped inside. He paused briefly, taking in the scene before him, Joanna's rigid posture, Barrett's proprietary stance. Something flickered across his face, recognition, perhaps, or understanding before he approached them. "Joanna," he greeted her warmly, deliberately standing between her and Barrett. "I hope I'm not late." "Not at all," she replied, relief evident in her voice. "Xavier, this is Samuel Barrett, owner of the Silver Crown Mining Company. Mr. Barrett, Xavier Sutton." The men sized each other up, Barrett's handshake noticeably firmer than necessary, Xavier's expression pleasantly neutral yet watchful. "Sutton," Barrett mused. "Any relation to Jeremiah Sutton, who owned the North Range some years back?" "My father," Xavier confirmed. I've been away for some time, but I've returned to establish myself here again. Barrett's smile tightened. Well, you've chosen an interesting time to return. Unionville isn't the boomtown it once was. So I've heard, Xavier replied evenly, but I've never been one to follow booms. I prefer stable ground under my feet. Barrett's eyes narrowed slightly at the veiled reference. Well, I won't keep you from your meeting. Mrs. Sinclair will continue our discussion another time. With a curt nod to both of them, Barrett departed, the bell above the door jingling sharply with his exit. Once he was gone, Xavier turned to Joanna. An admirer of yours? Joanna sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly. Hardly. Mr. Barrett has been trying to purchase my land for the past 2 years. He owns the water rights to most of the properties surrounding mine, and my stream is the only thing preventing him from controlling the entire watershed. Understanding dawned on Xavier's face. And a man like that doesn't take no for an answer easily. No, Joanna agreed, he doesn't, but enough about Barrett. I promised to show you what properties might be available. Xavier nodded, though his eyes lingered on the door through which Barrett had departed. Let me help you with your supplies first. Then perhaps we could discuss it over lunch. The hotel restaurant has improved since I was last here, at least according to the breakfast I had this morning. After gathering her supplies and loading them into her buckboard, Joanna found herself seated across from Xavier in the Western Hotel's modest dining room. The space was nearly empty, save for a traveling salesman in the corner and the elderly Washburn couple who had run the hotel for as long as anyone could remember. Over plates of roast beef and potatoes, Joanna outlined the properties she knew were available, mostly abandoned homesteads whose owners had given up on the harsh Nevada landscape or followed the next silver strike. Xavier listened attentively, asking questions about water access and grazing quality, his knowledge of ranching evident in his detailed inquiries. There's also the Jackson place, Joanna mentioned, hesitating slightly. 5 miles west of my property, good water, decent pasturage. Henry Jackson died last winter and his daughter in Sacramento is looking to sell. Xavier's eyes met hers. That would make us neighbors. It would, Joanna acknowledged, a flush rising to her cheeks that she attributed to the hot tea she was sipping. Would that be agreeable to you? Xavier asked, his voice softer now. Joanna set down her cup. Why did you really come back, Xavier, after all these years? He was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. I told you to fulfill a promise to my father, and is that all? Their eyes met, and in that moment, the years between them seemed to collapse. No, Xavier admitted. That's not all. The weight of unspoken words hung between them, interrupted only when Mrs. Washburn approached to clear their plates. By tacit agreement, they postponed further discussion, focusing instead on practical matters as Xavier paid for their meal and they stepped out onto Unionville's main street. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as they walked toward Joanna's wagon. The town was quiet, most residents having retreated indoors to escape the midday heat. As they reached her buckboard, Xavier helped her climb up onto the seat. I'd like to see this Jackson place, he said, his hand lingering on hers. Would tomorrow be too soon to ride out there? Joanna nodded. I could show you after the morning chores are done. Say around 10, I'll be at your ranch at 10, he confirmed. His eyes held hers for a moment longer than necessary before he stepped back. Until tomorrow, Joanna. She watched him walk back toward the hotel, his straight-backed figure so familiar yet different from the boy she had once known. As she turned her wagon toward home, Joanna couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow might bring and whether Xavier Sutton's return would prove to be the salvation or complication her life didn't need. The following morning, Xavier arrived precisely at 10, riding a magnificent chestnut gelding that pranced eagerly beneath him. Joanna was waiting on her porch, dressed in a practical riding skirt and jacket, her hair neatly braided and pinned under a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun. Ready, Xavier called as he dismounted, tying his horse to the hitching post. Joanna nodded, gesturing toward the barn. I've already saddled Pepper, let me just get my canteen. Soon they were riding side by side across the Nevada landscape, the spring sunshine warming their shoulders as they followed a well-worn trail westward. Conversation flowed easily between them, memories of shared childhood adventures, stories of Xavier's years on the frontier, Joanna's experiences keeping her ranch afloat after Thomas's death. "It couldn't have been easy," Xavier commented as they paused to water their horses at a small creek. "Running the ranch alone all these years," Joanna shrugged, watching as Pepper drank deeply. "I had help at first, neighbors, friends of Thomas, but as time passed and the mines began to fail, many moved on. I learned to do most things myself." "You always were stubborn," Xavier remarked with a smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I prefer to call it determined," she countered, returning his smile. They remounted and continued west, the terrain gradually changing as they approached the Jackson property. The land here rolled more gently, with stands of pine and juniper offering welcome shade. When they crested a small rise, Xavier reined in his horse, taking in the view before them. The Jackson homestead sprawled across a natural bowl in the landscape, a simple two-story house, a large barn, and several outbuildings, all showing signs of neglect but still structurally sound. Beyond the buildings, grassland stretched toward distant mountains, a stream cutting a silver path through the property. "It's better than I remembered," Xavier said, his voice quiet with appreciation. "Henry always did have an eye for good land." Joanna watched his face, seeing the calculations happening behind his eyes. "The house needs work, but the foundations are solid, and the water rights are secure. The stream originates on Forest Service land to the north." Xavier nodded, turning to her with a smile that made her heart skip. "Show me around." They spent the next 2 hours exploring the property, checking fences, examining the house and barn, and discussing the potential for cattle grazing. By the time they stopped for lunch in the shade of a large cottonwood tree beside the stream, Joanna could see that Xavier was genuinely interested in the property. They spread a blanket Joanna had brought and shared the simple meal she had packed: cold chicken, bread, cheese, and apples. As they ate, Xavier grew thoughtful, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "What are you thinking?" Joanna asked, cutting an apple into slices. Xavier accepted a piece, considering his words carefully. "I'm thinking this could be exactly what I've been searching for." His eyes met hers. "A place to put down roots again." Something in his tone made Joanna pause. "Is that all you're thinking?" Xavier set down his apple slice, his expression turning serious. "No, I'm also thinking about how different things might have been if I hadn't left 12 years ago. If I had stayed and fought to keep my father's land instead of running off to make my fortune elsewhere." Joanna's heart quickened. "You can't change the past, Xavier." "No," he agreed, "but sometimes life offers second chances." He reached out, hesitantly covering her hand with his own. "Joanna," before he could continue, the sound of approaching horses interrupted them. They both turned to see 3 riders coming toward them from the direction of town. As they drew closer, Joanna recognized Samuel Barrett in the lead, flanked by 2 men she knew worked for his mining company. Xavier rose to his feet, offering Joanna his hand. She accepted it, standing beside him as the riders approached and reined in their mounts a few yards away. "Mrs. Sinclair," Barrett called, his voice carrying across the distance. "What a surprise to find you here." His eyes shifted to Xavier, his smile cooling. "And Mr. Sutton as well, taking in the sights." "We're inspecting the Jackson property," Xavier replied evenly. "I'm considering purchasing it." Barrett's eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Interesting timing." "I was just on my way to Sacramento myself to discuss this very property with Elizabeth Jackson. I've made her quite a generous offer." Joanna felt Xavier tense beside her. "Is that right?" Xavier responded, his tone carefully neutral. "The property isn't listed with any land agent in Unionville." "No, it isn't," Barrett agreed. "But in business it pays to be proactive, especially when valuable resources are concerned." His gaze swept across the land meaningfully. Joanna stepped forward. "Mr. Barrett, this land has been a working ranch for 30 years. The water here supports the cattle and the natural ecosystem. Surely you don't intend to divert it for mining operations?" Barrett's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My intentions are my own concern, Mrs. Sinclair. But speaking of water rights, have you reconsidered my offer for your property? The situation in Unionville is changing rapidly. It would be a shame if you found yourself isolated." The threat in his words was barely veiled. Xavier moved closer to Joanna, his presence reassuring beside her. Mr. Barrett, he said calmly, I believe Mrs. Sinclair has made her position clear. Perhaps it's time you respected her decision. Barrett's expression hardened. This doesn't concern you, Sutton. You've been gone a long time. Things work differently in Unionville now. Some things never change, Xavier countered, including the law regarding water rights and property ownership. If Mrs. Sinclair doesn't wish to sell, that's her right. The two men who accompanied Barrett shifted in their saddles, their hands moving subtly toward their holsters. Joanna felt the tension in the air thicken, reminiscent of the moments before a thunderstorm breaks. The law is open to interpretation, Barrett said coldly, especially when the county judge owes his position to the largest employer in the region. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Good day to you both. I look forward to our next conversation, Mrs. Sinclair. With that, Barrett turned his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. When they were out of earshot, Joanna released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That man is dangerous, Xavier said quietly, watching the retreating figures. Joanna nodded. More than you know, the pressure has been building for months. Last week my fence line was cut in 3 places, and 2 nights ago someone left a dead coyote on my porch. No proof it was Barrett, of course, but Xavier's expression darkened. Why didn't you tell me? It's not your problem, Xavier, Joanna replied, bending to fold the blanket they had been sitting on. I've handled worse. Xavier caught her arm gently, turning her to face him. It became my problem the moment I rode back into Unionville. Joanna, I didn't return just to buy land or fulfill old promises. Her heart thundered in her chest as she looked up at him. Then why did you come back? For a moment, it seemed as though he might answer with words. Instead, Xavier's hand moved to cup her cheek, his thumb gently tracing the line of her jaw. Then, with a deliberateness that took her breath away, he lowered his lips to hers. The kiss was tender, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Joanna found herself responding, her hands coming to rest against his chest as memories of their youth blended with the present moment. When they finally parted, his forehead rested against hers, their breath mingling in the space between them. That's why, he whispered. The ride back to Joanna's ranch was charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the approaching evening thunderclouds. They spoke little, both processing the significance of what had transpired between them and the confrontation with Barrett. By the time they reached her property, the western sky had turned a deep purple gray, promising rain before morning. You should stay for supper, Joanna said as they unsaddled their horses in her barn. The storm will hit before you can make it back to town. Xavier nodded, his hands working efficiently to remove his gelding's tack. I'd like that, and I think we have more to discuss now, given Barrett's interest in the Jackson place. Inside, Joanna busied herself preparing a simple meal while Xavier built a fire in the hearth against the coming chill. The domesticity of their movements around each other felt both novel and strangely familiar, as if they were stepping into roles long ago rehearsed but never performed. Over supper, they discussed Barrett's obvious intent to control all the water in the region and what it might mean for both of their futures if Xavier purchased the Jackson property. The conversation was practical, focused on strategies and potential legal recourses, carefully avoiding mention of the kiss they had shared. It wasn't until they had cleared the table and were sitting before the fire, coffee cups in hand, that Xavier broached the subject that had been hovering between them all evening. I need to know where we stand, Joanna, he said softly, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. What happened today? I've wanted that for longer than I care to admit, but I won't pressure you. If friendship is all you can offer, I'll respect that. Joanna set her cup down, gathering her courage. When you left 12 years ago, I thought you'd return within a year or two. I waited, Xavier. Even after I received word that you'd gone north to Wyoming, I waited. But then my father fell ill and Thomas was there, offering stability when I needed it most. Xavier nodded, understanding in his eyes. Thomas was a good man. I never resented him for winning what I was too foolish to claim. It wasn't about winning, Joanna corrected gently. Life happened to both of us, taking us down different paths. And now those paths have crossed again, Xavier observed. The question is, where do they lead from here? Outside, thunder rumbled and rain began to patter against the windows. Joanna rose and moved to stand by the hearth, watching the flames curl and dance around the logs. I don't know, Xavier. So much has changed. We're different people now. Xavier joined her, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Some things haven't changed, Joe. The way I feel when I look at you, that's the same as it was when we were young, maybe stronger now, tempered by time and experience. Joanna turned to face him, searching his eyes for any sign of reservation. Are you certain? Because I can't bear to be left waiting again. I've built a life here, an independent life. I won't give that up, not even for me, Xavier finished. I would never ask you to. What I want is to stand beside you, not in front of you, to build something together on equal ground. The sincerity in his voice made her breath catch. Slowly, deliberately, Joanna reached up to touch his face, tracing the scar above his eyebrow with gentle fingers. It's been too long, she whispered, the words holding all the yearning of their years apart. Xavier covered her hand with his own, turning to press a kiss to her palm. Then you've waited just enough, he murmured, drawing her into his arms. This time when they kissed, there was no hesitation, only the certainty of two hearts finding their way back to each other after years of separation. Outside, the storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows and wind howling around the eaves. But within the warmth of Joanna's home, a different kind of storm was brewing, one of rekindled passion and newfound promise. Xavier stayed the night, sleeping on the settee in Joanna's parlor despite her assurances that the spare bedroom was available. I respect your home and your reputation, he had insisted. Unionville may be changing, but some traditions are worth honoring. In the morning, they awoke to a transformed landscape. The rain had washed everything clean, and the desert bloomed with renewed vigor. Over breakfast, they made plans to ride into town together to send a telegram to Elizabeth Jackson in Sacramento, expressing Xavier's interest in the property before Barrett could finalize any deal. As they prepared to leave, Joanna noticed a rider approaching from the direction of town. She recognized Caleb Wilson, the young deputy sheriff whose father had been a friend of Thomas's. "Morning, Mrs. Sinclair," Caleb called as he dismounted. "Mr. Sutton." He nodded respectfully to Xavier, clearly having heard of his return. "What brings you out this way, Caleb?" Joanna asked, noting the official-looking document in his hand. The deputy's expression was apologetic. "Court order, madam. Sheriff asked me to deliver it personally." He handed the paper to Joanna. "It's regarding your water rights. There's to be a hearing next week." Joanna unfolded the document, her face paling as she read. "This says my claim to the stream is being challenged on grounds of improper filing. That's ridiculous. Thomas registered everything properly when we purchased this land." Caleb shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, madam. But Mr. Barrett's lawyers claim there was an irregularity with the survey markers. The judge has agreed to hear arguments." Xavier took the paper, scanning it quickly. "Judge Monroe, is he the county judge Barrett mentioned yesterday?" Caleb nodded. "Appointed 2 years ago after Judge Harmon retired. He tends to see things Mr. Barrett's way most times." Joanna's jaw tightened. "This is harassment, pure and simple. Barrett thinks if he can't buy my land, he'll take my water instead, leaving me with no choice but to sell." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Sinclair," Caleb said sincerely. "For what it's worth, most folks in town think it's a dirty business. But with the mines producing less each month, many are afraid to speak against the company." After Caleb departed, Joanna and Xavier changed their plans. Instead of sending a telegram, they rode directly to Unionville's small courthouse to examine the original property records. What they found confirmed Joanna's suspicions. Someone had indeed altered the survey markers on her land, moving them just enough to create confusion about the boundary where the stream entered her property. "This is criminal," Xavier muttered as they left the courthouse. "Barrett's trying to steal your water through legal chicanery." Joanna's face was set with determination. "He won't succeed. My father witnessed the original survey, and old Ben Hawkins, who did the work, is still alive, living with his daughter in Carson City. I'll send for him to testify if needed." They separated briefly, Xavier to the land office to inquire about the Jackson property, Joanna to send telegrams to both Ben Hawkins and Elizabeth Jackson. When they reunited for lunch at the hotel, Xavier's expression was grim. Barrett wasn't bluffing. "He's already made an offer on the Jackson place above market value. The land agent confirmed it. Joanna's heart sank, and my telegram to Mrs. Jackson might not reach her in time. Xavier reached across the table, taking her hand. I've sent a counter-offer substantially higher. It stretches my resources to the limit, but if it secures the property, it will be worth it. Xavier, you can't spend everything you've earned just to protect what matters, he interrupted gently. I can and I will. This isn't just about land, Joanna. It's about standing against men like Barrett who think their money gives them the right to take whatever they want. As they spoke, the door to the hotel dining room opened, and Samuel Barrett himself entered, accompanied by two men in expensive suits, his lawyers, Joanna presumed. Barrett spotted them immediately, a cold smile spreading across his face as he approached their table. Mrs. Sinclair, Mr. Sutton, he greeted them with false cordiality. Discussing the upcoming hearing, I presume. I do hope you've secured adequate legal representation. Water law can be so complex. Xavier rose slowly to his feet, his posture relaxed yet somehow imposing. Mr. Barrett, I believe your business is with Mrs. Sinclair's attorneys, not with her directly. Any further attempts to intimidate her could be construed as tampering with a witness in a legal proceeding. One of Barrett's lawyers placed a restraining hand on his employer's arm, murmuring something too low to hear. Barrett's smile tightened, but he nodded curtly. Of course, no intimidation intended, merely friendly advice between neighbors. His gaze shifted to Joanna. Though I must say, Mrs. Sinclair, your choice of companions raises interesting questions about your judgment. Before Xavier could respond, Joanna stood as well, her voice steady and clear. Mr. Barrett, I consider your comment both inappropriate and revealing of your character. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have pressing matters to attend to. Barrett's face darkened, but with his lawyers present, he merely inclined his head and moved to a table across the room. As Joanna and Xavier departed, they could feel his eyes boring into their backs, his anger almost palpable in the air between them. Outside on the boardwalk, Xavier released a tense breath. That man is becoming more dangerous by the day. I don't like leaving you alone at your ranch while this situation escalates. Joanna considered his words carefully. I've managed thus far, but I won't pretend I'm not concerned. Barrett's men have been growing bolder with their accidents around my property. Xavier nodded decisively. Then it's settled. Until this matter is resolved, I'll stay in your barn, close enough to help if needed, but respecting propriety. Joanna started to protest, but recognized the wisdom in his suggestion. With Barrett's aggression mounting, having Xavier nearby would provide not only practical protection but peace of mind. Very well, she agreed, but only until after the hearing. That evening, as Xavier settled into the small room adjoining her barn that had once housed a ranch hand, Joanna found herself reflecting on how quickly her life had changed in just a few days. Xavier's return had unleashed a torrent of emotions and complications, yet she felt more alive than she had in years. The pending water rights hearing and Barrett's threats were serious concerns, but facing them with Xavier beside her made them seem less insurmountable. The days leading up to the hearing passed in a flurry of preparation. Ben Hawkins arrived from Carson City, his aged body frail but his mind and memory sharp as ever. He confirmed that the survey markers had indeed been tampered with and agreed to testify to that effect. Joanna hired Marcus Wheeler, a respected attorney from Virginia City who specialized in water rights disputes, spending a significant portion of her savings to secure his services. Throughout it all, Xavier was a constant presence riding the boundaries of her property each morning and evening, helping with ranch chores and joining her for supper each night, their conversations stretching long into the evening as they shared stories of their years apart and tentatively began planning a future together. 3 days before the hearing, a telegram arrived from Elizabeth Jackson, addressed to Xavier. Barrett's offer had been substantial, but she had accepted Xavier's counter-offer out of respect for her father's wishes that the land remain a working ranch. The property would be his as soon as the paperwork was processed. The news should have been cause for celebration, but that same evening, one of Joanna's outbuildings was found burning. Xavier and Joanna worked together to extinguish the flames before they could spread, but the message was clear: Barrett was escalating his campaign of intimidation. The night before the hearing, After a particularly tense day of final preparations with attorney Wheeler, Joanna found herself unable to sleep. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and stepped onto her porch, gazing up at the star-filled Nevada sky. The night was peaceful, belying the conflict that had engulfed her life. A soft footfall alerted her to Xavier's presence before he spoke. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, joining her at the porch railing. Joanna shook her head. "Too much on my mind. What if we lose tomorrow, Xavier? What if Barrett manages to convince Judge Monroe that his claim is valid?" Xavier turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Then we appeal to a higher court. We fight as long as necessary. Barrett may have money and influence, but we have truth on our side and the support of more townspeople than you realize." Joanna sighed, leaning slightly against his solid presence. "I'm tired of fighting, Xavier. These past years, it's been one battle after another keeping the ranch running, fending off Barrett's offers, trying to prove that a woman can manage on her own." Xavier's arm slipped around her shoulders, drawing her closer. "You've proven that beyond any doubt, Joe. Your strength and determination are remarkable, but you don't have to face everything alone anymore, not if you don't want to." Joanna looked up at him, reading the promise in his eyes. "What are you saying, Xavier?" He took her hands in his touch warm against the cool night air. "I'm saying that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever challenges we face in the days to come, I want to face them with you not just as your neighbor or friend, but as your husband, if you'll have me." The words hung in the air between them, profound in their simplicity. Joanna felt tears spring to her eyes, not of sorrow, but of a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Are you certain? Your life would be tied to all of this, the ranch, the conflicts with Barrett, everything." Xavier smiled, reaching up to brush away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I lost you once through my own foolishness. I won't lose you again." Joanna's heart swelled with emotion. All the years of waiting, of building her independent life, had led to this moment, not to surrender that independence, but to share it with the man who had always held a piece of her heart. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you, Xavier Sutton." He gathered her in his arms then, his kiss a seal upon their promise. When they finally parted, Joanna rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she murmured, "we face it together." "Together," Xavier agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Now and always." The morning of the hearing dawned bright and clear, the courthouse in Unionville unusually crowded as townsfolk gathered to witness what many considered a battle for the soul of their community. Barrett's attempt to seize Joanna's water rights had become symbolic of the larger conflict between mining interests and the ranchers and farmers who had established the town before silver was discovered. Joanna entered the courthouse on Xavier's arm, her navy blue dress and matching hat lending her a dignity that belied her inner nervousness. Attorney Wheeler met them at the door, his confidence reassuring as they took their seats at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle, Barrett sat with his two lawyers, his expression smug as Judge Monroe entered and called the court to order. The proceedings began with Barrett's attorney presenting their case, a technical argument that the original survey of Joanna's property had been flawed, placing the stream incorrectly within her boundaries. They produced doctored maps and a paid surveyor who testified that the water rightfully belonged to land Barrett had recently acquired adjacent to Joanna's ranch. When it was their turn, Attorney Wheeler methodically dismantled the opposition's claims. Ben Hawkins testified to the accuracy of his original survey, pointing out specific geographical features that proved the stream had always flowed through what was now Joanna's property. Wheeler then called several longtime residents who confirmed that the Sinclair Ranch had used that water continuously for over 30 years without dispute, until Barrett's recent interest in the area. The most damning testimony came from an unexpected source. Caleb Wilson, the young deputy, took the stand to report that he had witnessed Barrett's men moving survey markers on the disputed boundary 2 weeks earlier. Though Barrett's lawyers objected vehemently, Judge Monroe allowed the testimony, his expression growing increasingly troubled as the evidence of tampering mounted. By mid-afternoon, it was clear that public sentiment in the courtroom had shifted decisively in Joanna's favor. Even Judge Monroe, despite his ties to Barrett, seemed disturbed by the blatant manipulation of evidence. When Barrett himself took the stand and began making veiled accusations about Joanna's character and her relationship with Xavier, murmurs of disapproval rippled through the crowd. Wheeler's cross-examination was surgical, forcing Barrett to admit that his interest in the water stemmed not from any legitimate need, but from his desire to control all resources in the area. When Barrett finally stepped down, his face was flushed with anger and embarrassment. After brief closing arguments, Judge Monroe called for a recess to consider his ruling. As the courtroom emptied, Xavier squeezed Joanna's hand reassuringly. "It went well," he murmured. "Better than we could have hoped." Joanna nodded, though she knew that in a small town like Unionville, justice wasn't always determined by evidence alone. Barrett's influence ran deep, and Judge Monroe's position depended on the continuing prosperity of the mines. An hour later, when court reconvened, Judge Monroe's expression was grave as he delivered his ruling. Having considered all testimony and evidence presented, this court finds in favor of Mrs. Joanna Sinclair. The water rights to the stream in question are confirmed as belonging to the Sinclair property, as originally surveyed and recorded. Furthermore, given the evidence of tampering with survey markers, this court orders an investigation into possible criminal charges against parties unknown. Relief washed over Joanna like a cool rain after a drought. Beside her, Xavier released a breath he seemed to have been holding throughout the judge's statement. Around them, many in the courtroom broke into approving nods and smiles. Barrett, however, was livid. He rose abruptly, ignoring his lawyer's attempts to calm him. "This is an outrage," he declared, pointing an accusing finger at Judge Monroe. "You've been adequately compensated to ensure the right outcome in this case." The courtroom fell silent at this admission of attempted bribery. Judge Monroe's face hardened. "Mr. Barrett, you are in contempt of this court. Sheriff, please remove Mr. Barrett and hold him pending further investigation into his statement just made." As the sheriff led a protesting Barrett away, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Wheeler turned to Joanna and Xavier, satisfaction evident in his normally stoic features. "Congratulations, Mrs. Sinclair. Not only have you secured your water rights, but it appears Mr. Barrett has effectively ended his own campaign of intimidation with that outburst." Outside the courthouse, well-wishers surrounded Joanna, many admitting they had long resented Barrett's heavy-handed tactics but had been afraid to speak out. Eliza Donovan embraced her warmly, declaring that this called for a celebration at the general store later that week. As the crowd dispersed, Joanna and Xavier found themselves standing alone on the courthouse steps, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across Unionville's Main Street. "It's over," Joanna said softly, hardly daring to believe it. "After all this time, it's finally over." Xavier took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "One chapter ends, another begins. Shall we go home, Joe?" Home. The word held new meaning now, encompassing not just her ranch, but the future they would build together. Joanna smiled, feeling lighter than she had in years. "Yes," she replied. "Let's go home." The following weeks passed in a blur of activity. Xavier took possession of the Jackson property, immediately beginning repairs on the house and outbuildings with help from several local men, eager for work now that Barrett's influence had waned. Joanna divided her time between her own ranch and helping Xavier, their evenings spent planning their wedding and their shared future. Samuel Barrett, facing charges of attempted bribery and evidence tampering, had fled Unionville in the night, abandoning his mining interests. Rumors placed him in Idaho territory, attempting to rebuild his fortune with diminishing success. Without his aggressive management, the Silver Crown Mining Company was reorganizing under new leadership, taking a more sustainable approach that balanced resource extraction with the needs of the community. 6 weeks after the hearing, on a perfect June morning, Joanna stood before the mirror in her bedroom, smoothing the ivory satin of her wedding dress. It was simpler than what many brides might choose, but elegantly tailored to suit her slender frame with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was arranged in a classic style, adorned with small white flowers from her garden. A knock at her door announced Eliza Donovan, who had come to help her prepare. "Oh, Joanna," Eliza breathed, clasping her hands together. You look absolutely beautiful. Xavier won't know what hit him. Joanna laughed, a hint of nervousness in the sound. Do you think so? It's been so long since I thought about such things. Trust me, Eliza assured her, adjusting a flower in Joanna's hair. That man has eyes only for you, has since the moment he rode back into town, if you ask me. The wedding was to be held on Joanna's property, under the large cottonwood tree near the stream that had caused so much conflict. Now the water flowed peacefully, a symbol of the life she and Xavier would build together. Nearly everyone in Unionville had been invited, along with ranchers and farmers from the surrounding area, all eager to celebrate what many viewed as a triumph of justice as much as a union of hearts. As Eliza helped her with her final preparations, Joanna found her thoughts drifting to Thomas. There was no guilt in her happiness today, only gratitude for the years they had shared and the strength she had found within herself during her widowhood. Thomas would have approved of Xavier, she believed would have wanted her to find love again. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, conducted by Reverend Michaels from the small church in Unionville. As Joanna walked toward Xavier, who waited beneath the cottonwood in his best suit, she saw in his eyes everything she had ever wanted: respect, admiration, and a love that had withstood years of separation only to grow stronger upon their reunion. Dearly beloved, Reverend Michaels began, his voice carrying across the gathered assembly, we are gathered here today to witness the union of Xavier Sutton and Joanna Sinclair in holy matrimony. The traditional words washed over Joanna as she stood facing Xavier, their hands joined between them. When it came time for their vows, Xavier spoke with a clarity and conviction that brought tears to her eyes. Joanna, I promise to love and cherish you all the days of my life. To stand beside you as your equal, to honor your strength and independence even as we build our life together. The years we spent apart taught me that true happiness comes not from possessions or achievements, but from sharing one's heart with the right person. You are that person for me, always have been, always will be. When it was her turn, Joanna's voice trembled slightly with emotion, but her words were firm. Xavier, I take you as my husband, promising to love and support you through whatever challenges life may bring. I pledge to you my partnership, my trust, and my heart, grateful that our paths have finally converged after so many years apart. In you, I have found not just love, but a true companion for the journey ahead. As they exchanged rings, simple gold bands that had been crafted by Unionville's jeweler, Joanna felt a sense of rightness settle over her. When Reverend Michaels pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier's kiss was both tender and promising, sealing their vows before friends and neighbors who erupted in enthusiastic applause. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with tables set up across Joanna's front yard, laden with food contributed by every household in attendance. There was music and dancing, laughter and heartfelt toasts to the couple who had, in many ways, helped restore Unionville's sense of community and justice. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the celebration, Xavier led Joanna away from the festivities to a quiet spot near the stream. In the distance, they could see both of their properties, her established ranch and his newly renovated homestead, soon to be connected by more than just proximity. Happy, Mrs. Sutton? Xavier asked softly, his arms encircling her waist as they gazed at the landscape that was their shared domain. Joanna leaned back against him, savoring the solid warmth of his chest against her back. Very happy, Mr. Sutton, though I must admit that name will take some getting used to, Xavier chuckled, pressing a kiss to her temple. Take all the time you need. We have the rest of our lives ahead of us. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the eastern sky. Then Joanna turned in his arms, her expression suddenly serious. What is it, Joe? Xavier asked, concerned by the change in her demeanor. Nothing's wrong, she assured him quickly. It's just, there's something I haven't told you, something I've been waiting for the right moment to share. Xavier's brow furrowed slightly. You can tell me anything, you know that. Joanna took a deep breath, a smile breaking through her serious expression. The Jackson property, I didn't just suggest it because it was available. I suggested it because I knew how much you always admired it as a boy. I remember you telling me once when we were teenagers that if you could own any piece of land in Nevada, it would be the Jackson place. Xavier's eyes widened in surprise. You remembered that, after all these years? Joanna nodded, her hands coming to rest against his chest. I remembered everything, Xavier, every dream you shared, every promise we made. Even during my marriage to Thomas, even when I thought you were never coming back, I kept those memories safe. Emotion welled in Xavier's eyes as he pulled her closer. Oh, Jo, he murmured against her hair. I don't deserve you. Don't say that, she whispered fiercely. We deserve each other, deserve this happiness we've found. Everything we've been through, all the years apart, they've led us here, to this moment, stronger and more certain than we could have been as those young dreamers we once were. Xavier pulled back slightly, framing her face with his hands, his gaze intense. I love you, Joanna Sutton, more than I have words to express. And I love you, she replied, rising on tiptoe to press her lips to his in a kiss that spoke of both passion and promise. As they made their way back to the celebration, hand in hand, Joanna reflected on the journey that had brought them to this day. From childhood friends to young lovers, separated by circumstance only to find each other again when they needed it most. There would be challenges ahead. She knew running 2 ranches, building their life together, perhaps starting a family despite her advancing years. But with Xavier beside her, those challenges seemed like opportunities rather than obstacles. The party continued well into the night, lanterns illuminating the yard as friends and neighbors celebrated not just a wedding, but the renewal of hope in Unionville. When the last guests had departed, Xavier carried Joanna across the threshold of her home, their home now in keeping with tradition. In the privacy of their bedroom, as moonlight spilled through the curtains, they came together as husband and wife, their passion tempered by tenderness, their bodies expressing what words could not fully convey. Afterward, as Joanna lay in Xavier's arms, she felt a sense of completion, of having finally found the missing piece of herself that had been absent all these years. What are you thinking? Xavier asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her bare shoulder. Joanna smiled in the darkness. I was thinking about time, how it stretches and contracts, how 10 years can feel like an eternity when you're waiting, yet disappear in an instant when you finally have what you've longed for. Xavier's arms tightened around her. No more waiting, Jo. From now on, we face each day together. Together, she echoed, nestling closer to his warmth. That's all I've ever wanted. 2 years later, Joanna stood on the porch of their home, watching as Xavier rode in from checking the boundary fences of their now combined property. Beside her, in a small rocking chair built by Xavier's hands, sat their daughter Catherine, a cherubic 18-month-old with her father's chestnut hair and her mother's determined spirit. The ranch had prospered under their joint management, expanding its cattle operation while maintaining the natural beauty of the land they both cherished. Unionville itself had undergone changes. The mines were producing less each year, but new businesses had opened to serve the growing number of ranches and farms in the region. Samuel Barrett had never returned, his name now merely a footnote in the town's history. As Xavier dismounted and made his way to the porch, his face lighting up at the sight of his wife and daughter, Joanna felt a wave of gratitude for the life they had built together. It hadn't always been easy. There had been difficult seasons, disagreements to navigate, the challenge of merging 2 independent souls into one partnership. But through it all, their love had only deepened, strengthened by mutual respect and shared purpose. Xavier bounded up the steps, scooping Catherine into his arms and spinning her around as she giggled with delight. Then he turned to Joanna, his free arm pulling her close for a kiss that still made her heart race. How are my 2 favorite ladies today? He asked, his smile warming her from within. We're perfect, Joanna replied, leaning against his solid frame, just waiting for you to come home. Xavier kissed the top of Catherine's head, then met Joanna's eyes, his expression growing serious. Have you told anyone else yet? Joanna shook her head, her hand unconsciously moving to rest on her still flat stomach. No, I wanted you to be the first to know for certain. Dr. Miller confirmed it yesterday. We're having another baby due in early spring. Xavier's face broke into a grin of pure joy. At 45, Joanna had believed Catherine would be their only child, a miracle in itself given her age. This second pregnancy was unexpected but deeply welcomed, Another blessing in a life already rich with them. I love you, Xavier whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Both of you. All three of you, he corrected, his hand covering hers where it rested protectively over their unborn child. As the sun began to set behind the mountains, casting long golden rays across their land, Joanna reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From the moment Xavier had ridden back into her life to the whispered words that had marked their reunion, "It's been too long," and his reply, "Then you've waited just enough," every step had led to this perfect present, this family they had created together. The waiting was over. The future stretched before them, bright with promise and possibility. And whatever it might hold, they would face it as they had faced everything since their reunion together, their love a steady anchor in life's ever-changing tides.